This is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Today on the Perception in Action podcast, my interview with Emma Mosley, lecturer in the School of Sport, Health and Social Sciences at Southampton Solent University. Hi everyone, welcome to the Perception in Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Emma Mosley. Emma received her BSc in Sports Psychology and Coaching Sciences from Bournemouth University and is currently in the final stages of completing her PhD. In the interview, we discussed topics including emotional intelligence, guidelines for using heart rate variability, performance under pressure, links between personality traits and sports, and advice for people interested in pursuing sports psychology accreditation. Hope you enjoy!
Not 10 years ago, I was a child. I was a good boy and you let me go. Now I'm on a talk show.
Today my guest is Emma Mosley, lecturer in the School of Sport, Health and Social Sciences at Southampton Solent University. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me, Emma.
No problem.
To start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in sports science?
Yeah, sure. So I was always interested in sport as a child, and I always knew I wanted to do something in sport. In school, I wanted to do biology and PE A-levels, but unfortunately they clashed. So I chose PE, so physical education, but I chose psychology instead, which actually drew me towards sports psychology. So it was almost a twist of fate that kind of took me towards sports psychology. And then I chose to do this at Bournemouth University. So I did an undergraduate in sports psychology and coaching science. And in my undergraduate, we have a compulsory placement year. And on that year, I decided to do a little bit of coaching, but also I was a research assistant at Southampton University under Mark Jones, and this placement involved loads of psychophysiology research within the lab, and that basically made me love the area, and I've pretty much pursued it ever since. And that's pretty much my background.
That's great. Sometimes course clashes can work out for the best.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So the first topic I wanted to talk to you about was something you worked on, emotional intelligence. And I think I told you when we communicated before, people have asked me to talk about this and I know absolutely nothing about it. So I was wondering, Can you tell us what it is for me and everyone else that might not know, and how it relates to sports performance?
Yeah, of course. So emotional intelligence defined basically is how people deal with their own and other people's emotions. And it almost represents a constellation of emotional perceptions, which is obviously really important in terms of the sporting environment. Previously, there were two opposing models linked to the ability and kind of trait side of things. However, I'm going to talk about a more recent model that's kind of brought these areas together for a more holistic approach in emotional intelligence. So the tripartite model suggests that there's three different levels of emotional intelligence. So the first level is all about knowledge. So basically, what do people know about their emotions? So in a sporting context, it might be an athlete can start to feel that they get angry and they have an awareness that an emotion is happening. It might also be that they have knowledge of some techniques that might help them to reduce this emotion. At the second level of this model, it's actually more about the ability. So almost like the degree to which people are capable of actually kind of regulating this emotion and kind of putting in those strategies to help them with it. So if we go back to the same example, it might be that this particular athlete, after practicing a breathing technique to help with anger, for example, they can better understand their own body and why they might be feeling this emotion and cues within the environment that might trigger this emotion. And actually they can then implement the technique when it's most required, so they are able to do this. And at the third level of this model, which is more of my own interest, is actually what people usually do during emotional situations, which is obviously directly linked to the trait level of this model. So, for example, if this player kind of keeps using this technique for the breathing for anger, It might be that they become really good at it and they really understand when and how to use it. And therefore it becomes more of a built-in technique, and it could almost start to happen autonomously. So then we can kind of link it to this stable behavior, which could be classed more of a trait to help with emotions that arise. So for this example, we can see that these three levels are kind of loosely connected, and it does help us to kind of understand how emotional intelligence can affect athletes across these three levels. In terms of assessing emotional intelligence, the scale that I've been using is the TEIQ questionnaire, so Trait Emotional Intelligence Questionnaire, which measures 15 subscales, 4 factors, and global emotional intelligence as a whole. So just quickly, I'll break down the 4 main factors, which are well-being, emotionality, self-control, and sociability. The well-being factor represents like a generalized sense of well-being that extends from past achievements to future expectations. So within sport, we might have an athlete that's previously done really well in a competition. So actually approaching another competition, they might actually have improved well-being and feel better about the next competition that comes up. Emotionality is defined as individuals understanding their own and other emotions more effectively. So it might be that they can understand their emotional state during a competition or actually read another player's emotions. So for example, in tennis, it might be that they're watching for body language cues of the other player. So like throwing their hands up in frustration and things like that. It might also be on like a team level, so understanding emotional contagion and how we can actually catch emotions from others. Self-control is defined as the ability to regulate emotions and impulses, but also manage external pressure and stress. So, for example, a rugby player with high self-control may be better able to control their impulses after a hard tackle, for example. And the last one, sociability, it actually indicates more emotion management in terms of influencing others, being assertive and having social awareness of emotion. So if we had a captain who is high in sociability, they actually might be better able to manage the emotions of the team, but also can be assertive in an emotionally charged situation. So hopefully that kind of explains emotional intelligence in a nutshell, and like how it can affect athletes on lots of different levels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So when you measure this, do athletes kind of run the gamut of people that are completely unaware of their emotional reaction to people that are really in tune with it, or is it pretty consistent?
So it will really depend on, obviously, the type of athletes that you're asking, because we have seen differences between team and individual athletes. Okay. And it also might be that we see differences between people who do compete in sport and for those who don't.
Okay. And I think you're getting at this a little bit with some of the breathing exercises and things, but is emotional intelligence something that we can improve through training?
Yes, definitely. And this is actually something that's almost quite new and important in terms of like applied sports psychology. So there has been research that's looked into training emotional intelligence, and it has been shown to be effective in developing this trait. So almost through just simple education of what is an emotion, when do these emotions occur, how do I understand emotions in my teammates? And actually, we found in one study that it did actually improve trait emotional intelligence in rugby players. And there's plenty of ways to become more aware of your emotions and actually how to cope with them. So in terms of my applied practice, a nice example that I can share with you is I've used tasks like emotion charades. So I'm guessing everybody's kind of familiar with charades like you play at Christmas. Mm-hmm. But basically what I do is I put loads of different emotions in a pot. And what the athletes have to do is they have to pick it out, almost act it out to the other athletes in the room. So not only does it allow the athlete to understand the emotion and how it looks and feels in terms of themselves, but actually it allows other athletes to be able to read that emotion and try and guess what it is. So in this sense, developing this emotional awareness is really, really important, not only for like the individual, but for other people and how they can read emotions.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a lot of fun. But I could see how
they do normally enjoy it.
I could definitely see how that could be a value. And yeah, thank you for that. That was great. So I guess switching to another topic, another one that you've been doing a lot of work on, I saw in one of your recent papers, is heart rate variability. And I know a lot of people are interested in using this measure as a measure of kind of the stress and performance under pressure, but you have kind of done some work looking at some things that we need to take into account and some guidelines for using this variable effectively. Can you talk a little bit about that work?
Yeah, of course. So for those that obviously don't know what heart rate variability is, it's basically the time interval between our heartbeats. So it's not necessarily that if you take 60 beats per minute, it doesn't beat at every single second. It is really variable because we're constantly adapting to our environment. And like you mentioned, it can be a measure of how somebody is reacting to stress and pressure. And I think that's why it's becoming very, very popular, obviously, particularly within sports psychology. So we do obviously have a paper that has loads of guidelines on what to do when you want to use heart rate variability. But I've kind of come up with some very simple top tips on like using heart rate variability data. So the first one would be think about the type of research question you want to answer, because that will really depend on sort of experiment that you run, what sort of design you need to use, and actually what you want the information to tell you. I've used within subject design, which is recommended because it helps to control for any individual differences, and it can also reduce for the impacts of other external factors like medication or if the participants smoke or not. So yeah, that's the first one. You really need to have a think about what it is you want from the data and how you're going to run your experiment and what it's going to look like. Second tip, think about your experiment structure. So there's something that we've kind of brought out in this paper is almost the 3 R's of heart rate variability, which is resting, reactivity, and recovery. Now, by assessing these different areas, it gives us far more information about what is actually happening to the individual over the course of an event or a task in an experimental condition, for example. So you need to take different measures. Tonic measures are basically taken at one time point. So it might be that you take a 5-minute baseline or resting level of a participant. You take 5 minutes during the task that you want to test, and then you take 5 minutes after the task. Now, from this, you can get something called phasic measures, which is basically the difference between these time points, or like the changes in what's happening to the physiological system. So reactivity is the change from their resting state to the task. So did they have a decrease? Did they have an increase? Did they stay the same? And recovery is the change from task to post-task. So actually what's happening, were they able to recover from the task that you put them under? So for example, if it was something really stressful, could they get back to their resting level, or were they still really stressed after the task? Or actually, did they recover really well? And maybe why did they recover so well? So yeah, I'm actually thinking about like the time that you're going to take when you're going to measure heart rate variability is also really important. Thirdly, you need to think about like the finer details of heart rate variability measurement, because there's so many different variables you can get from it. There's a few different analysis software. So you really need to have a read around the area and see, you know, what's the most important things that you need to look out for in terms of the finer details. So for example, which equipment are you going to use? What is accessible to you? So for example, I use the eMotion Faro, which is actually reasonably cheap in terms of like the psychophysiological equipment, and it is relatively easy to use as well. It almost acts like a USB for data that you can clip onto somebody and collect data, so it is really simple to use. And finally, you need to think about confounding variables, because heart rate variability can be affected by a lot of different things, and if you don't necessarily control for them, it can impact your data. So things such as age, smoking, amount of sleep, amount of training somebody's done the day before can all have an impact on the data that you're going to get from the person. So it's really important you almost have a checklist of that before they actually take part in the experiment, so you can make sure you can control for anything and make sure that the data is reliable as possible. But yeah, there's a whole paper on this which goes into way more detail, but I would say those are kind of the 4 main things that I would make sure that you look at in terms of planning an experiment.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. I think those are good pieces of advice for almost any dependent measure you want to use. But
yeah,
I think I've seen kind of firsthand, I started playing around with it a couple of years ago, that it's pretty tricky. It's trickier than you think. It's not measuring beats per minute and walking away. There's a lot more to it. So I know you've also done some studies using heart rate variability, looking at how it relates to sports performance. I know you had a recent one come out. So what can you tell us about what you found about how predictive it is of like things like performance under pressure?
Yeah, so particularly we're looking at a variable that you can get from heart rate variability, which is called cardiac vagal activity. And it's basically derived from the parasympathetic system. And this measure has been associated with lots of different disciplines such as health, well-being, but obviously performance, which is what we're interested in. And we're interested in it because it can help us understand what's actually going on in terms of self-regulatory processes, so things like emotion regulation. Hence why, as pressure researchers, we're very interested in something that can really help us understand what's happening to the individual. In terms of how it's related to performance under pressure and, almost like skill performance, it will depend on what you're actually testing. So, for example, tasks involving executive function, so something like working memory, it might be that you need higher levels of cardiac vagal activity because that's been associated with better performance in that sense. But actually, if you're looking at something that doesn't involve executive function, the water is almost like a little bit muddier around this area because we're not necessarily sure how this relationship works between these two variables. So it's not really been explored in terms of during a skill because obviously movement can affect heart rate variability. So typically it's been explored between self-paced skills. So, for example, there was some biofeedback training research done by Paul and Garg who used it for basketball shooters. So they did some breathing techniques which helped to increase cardiac vagal activity, and they found that it helped players to deal with their anxiety better before a free throw, which suggests that there are really good links between heart rate variability and performance optimization. But we still don't necessarily know, what's actually happening during a skill. Obviously, that's prior to, which is important, but actually what's going on during can also be really important too. So from my current research, we can't necessarily suggest that skill performance is completely predicted by cardiac vagal activity. It's perhaps more of an indicator of successful factors for performance, such as self-regulation. So in my most recent paper, DART score was predicted by cardiac vagal activity, and actually a withdrawal predicted better performance. So we could almost suggest that those who were working harder to self-regulate in the high pressure condition to score a better DART score had this withdrawal, and they were regulating more effectively because they were putting more effort into their coping resources. So this almost contradicts the other side of the research where if the task involves executive function, you have to have higher levels. So we're still not necessarily sure in terms of, this long-term research question, how it's actually going to predict skilled performance, because previous thinking might suggest that it's almost like the higher the better. But actually, we need to look more at the changes in somebody's cardiac vagal activity from those different time points, the 3 Rs that I mentioned earlier, because then we can actually see how an individual is adapting across a situation rather than just looking at individual time points.
Yeah, no, I really like that that approach and that study. It's kind of what I try to do too, is linking kind of the processes, the performance to the physiological to the psychological. It's kind of a chain of events. So if you want to think of it that way, so it's never going to be like a simple one-to-one. I think it's there's always going to be complex interaction. So I think that's really interesting. I guess the last kind of general research topic I want to talk to you about is some of your work you've done on personality traits. And I know you've looked at it as kind of a few different angles. I think in that study you just mentioned, you looked at it, how it related to performance under pressure, I believe. And I know you've also looked at it in terms of how participation in sports relates to kind of some of the more positive things than kind of choking and failing under pressure. So can you talk a little bit about that personality trait work?
Yeah, sure. So particularly we're interested in something called personality trait-like individual differences. So they're almost kind of constellations that are part of personality, but they're also part of individual differences as well. And they don't necessarily belong to the main concepts of personality, for example, the Big Five. So we're almost interested in how these can either affect performance or almost like participation. So we have shown that almost as positive personality traits, for example, like perseverance, resilience, are associated when participating in sport. We typically find that athletes score higher on these traits than non-athletes. If you think about why this might be, we kind of have two views on it. So sport almost forces you into situations that can be quite emotionally charged or challenging. So it can almost develop these traits. So for example, something like resilience, you're always going to get knockbacks in sport. You're never going to have 100% win rate. So actually something like resilience can be developed from, kind of setbacks and, trying again, making sure that you keep going in the face of adversity. But actually on the other side, it might be that certain traits can almost make people play sports. So something like sensation seeking, so almost like going out there and seeking that adrenaline rush, might make people participate in more risky sports, like extreme sports. So something like base jumping, for example. So it might actually be that their trait will put them into a particular direction of sport. One interesting thing to note when we actually look at the breakdown in athletes themselves, we do find that there is a difference between those who participate in individual sports when compared to team sports. And in one study, we found that these positive traits were higher in individual athletes. So this could potentially be explained by the fact that when you're an individual athlete, you're on your own. You don't necessarily have someone to almost like boost you up when you're feeling down. You are very much kind of self-reliant. And again, using tennis as an example, it's such a mental game and you really are relying on yourself in that situation rather than a team sport where you have other people to actually influence you during performance. So I actually investigated this in my own data from the recent DART study, which was actually asked for by the reviewer. Because obviously I'd mentioned it in my limitations, the fact that we did have some individual and team participants. And I did find that there was a difference in emotional intelligence, particularly emotionality, between individual and team athletes. But then when we further assessed this in terms of performance, so did actually like individuals or team participants perform better under pressure, there was no effect. So we know that there are differences between individual and team athletes in terms of their personality, but actually future research could probably look at, well, does that affect their performance when they're doing the same task? Is there any kind of crossover between them that we could take and use in the field? So yeah, that's potentially something that I'm quite interested in post PhD.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. I don't think I've seen anybody do that kind of breakdown. In all of our studies, we usually just kind of, you're right, we lump them together. And lucky I've never had a reviewer ask me about that.
Yeah.
I guess so. That kind of your last comment leads into my last question about research-wise is, can you talk a little bit about kind of your current plans and near future plans in terms of research?
Yeah, sure. I'm actually completing my PhD at the moment. I'm hoping to submit early next year, so I'm in the final throes. So for anybody out there that's in the same position as me, apparently you do get there in the end. Yeah, so in terms of my current/future research, all my work at the moment is really revolving around my PhD, looking at the contribution of coping-related variables, so things like the traits that I've discussed, like our appraisal of stress, so using like challenge and threat theory, and also cardiac vagal activity, which is obviously, we get that measure from heart rate variability, on performance under pressure from different types of performance. So my first study, which isn't actually out yet, looked at working memory, but obviously looking at this different combination to see how we can predict working memory performance. Obviously, the second study is a DART paper that's just come out, so looking more at the psychomotor level of performance. And then my final study, which I actually found the most interesting out of all of them, is actually trying to take it to more of an ecological setting. So we're constantly in the lab with this sort of thing. So it's actually trying to get it out of the lab into a more realistic context so we can actually see what's happening with an athletic population. So my last study is looking at elite shooters and actually looking at what happens to them during almost like a simulated competition. And there's some really interesting findings coming out from that one. So a couple of those I'll share with you is that in terms of shooting performance, it actually directly affected how well the shooters recovered. So, for example, if a shooter had shot really, really badly, their cardiac vagal activity recovery was impaired. But if they shot really well, their cardiac vagal activity in terms of recovery almost improved. So it's actually a really interesting dynamic between, okay, we perform and then we have to recover to perform again. How does that previous performance affect us? And particularly within shooting, it's a really interesting sport because they actually have to shoot almost in bouts. So, for example, they might have a 60-shot competition, but they might break that 60-shot competition down into lots of 20-shot groups. So they will have an element of needing to recover in order to do another section of shooting, for example. And we know that if you think about momentum in sports, there's so many periods of recovery. So hopefully that can be another direction for future research because those findings I found absolutely fascinating. And then something else that came out from that is that higher levels of cardiac vagal activity actually during the task was predicted by trait emotion intelligence, but the self-control dimension. So actually like how well you can control yourself under pressure actually linked to an increase in cardiac vagal activity during a stressful situation. So again, looking at, okay, what if we train self-control? Can we actually make people have a better physiological response under pressure? But obviously, at the moment, these are all further questions that I will hopefully answer in the coming years.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That first finding, particularly, everybody talks about heart rate variability affects performance, but I don't see too many people talking about the other direction, right? What you're talking about with recovery. I think that's really interesting. How your past performance affects your heart rate variability. I guess the last question I have for you is kind of taking a different topic. I know that you're working your way through your BASES accreditation for becoming a performance psychologist, a registered performance psychologist. So I just wanted to get your take on kind of what that process has been like, and do you have any advice for anyone wanting to pursue that specifically, or just kind of in general becoming a sports psychologist?
So I had to go down the BASES route. So for anyone that doesn't know what that is, it's the British Association for Sport and Exercise Science, in order to become a sports scientist who's obviously working within psychology. So this involves 500 hours of supervised experience. So that's actually going out and obviously working with athletes. But it also includes compulsory workshops, so for things like ethics in sport, making sure that you learn about safeguarding as a practitioner, and also reflective practice, so how you actually understand and learn from your experiences, obviously during your supervised experience. So what you have to do is you have to put together 3 submissions across the span of your experience. I only have one more to go, but the PhD is definitely stopping that from happening at the moment. But it involves logging all your hours, reflecting on your experiences, providing evidence. So it might be like quotes from athletes or resources that you've used with athletes, and writing up case studies that you've worked. In terms of my advice for people wanting to pursue it, be prepared to do a lot of voluntary hours. You're not necessarily going to, rock up and get loads of paid work to do sports psychology. You really do have to create a reputation for yourself. And actually one of my first clients was an opera singer. So you need to be open to all walks of performance. So it's not necessarily just sport that you'll be working in. And actually that was probably one of the best lessons I've ever had in terms of using sports psychology literature in a music performance setting. And also just take what you can get. So, if it's just sitting in and watching another practitioner deliver a workshop, go and do it. Ask around. So if you've got any friends that are doing sport, try it with them first. You've got to be able to make these experiences for yourself so you can learn. And in terms of where I am now, in terms of my applied practice, I'm actually running a psychology program for an elite tennis academy. So it's working with their youth players, mainly around education. So again, looking at obviously the trait emotion intelligence development. So, what is confidence? What is motivation? What are emotions? Coping with stress. So it's actually giving them, the education that they need at that level to understand sports psychology before they actually, really come down to this one-to-one intervention sort of thing. And in terms of actually kind of finalising everything, BASES are currently working on and hopefully going to introduce a HCPC route, which is the Health and Care Professionals Council accreditation. So we can actually then call ourselves psychologists, because that term is actually protected at the moment by British Psychology Society. So hopefully once that goes ahead, we can actually call ourselves sports psychologists as well. So I definitely think there's a few different routes in the UK. And I know it might be maybe even more straightforward elsewhere, or there's obviously lots of different accreditation routes. And the BASES route for me has been really, really flexible in terms of my experience and the degree that I did. And I've really enjoyed it so far. And it hasn't necessarily stopped me from doing any work. So I definitely would recommend that to anyone that's kind of pursuing a career over here in the UK.
Well, that's great. I think, and there's some great advice. That was great, Emma. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me today.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Emma. Good luck in wrapping up the PhD in BASES accreditation. I'm looking forward to seeing more of your research in the future. Coming soon on the Perception in Action podcast, a look at some cases where athletes have overcome vision problems. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now.
Gone through St. Louis.